In this Sikha, the Rebbe is discussing the law of a Shivcha Charufa. A Shivcha Charufa is a woman that's half freed, half slave woman, and she was Mikudeshes, she's betrothed to a Eved Ivri, to a Jewish slave. And the Shivcha Charufa, the halachas of the Shivcha Charufa is if another man has relations with her, and the halacha is that she will need to get lashes for her Aveira, and the man will have to bring a carbon asham. Now, the Rambam paskins that a 9-year-old boy that had relations with the Shivcha Charufa, the same din applies. She gets malchus, and he has to bring a carbon. The Ravid asks, we don't find anywhere that a child should have to get a punishment. On the contrary, says the Ravid, if anything, she should be exempt as well, because in the Gemara we find that the two partners to this Aveira are compared to each other, and therefore, if he is exempt, because he is a minor, she should also be exempt, rather than the way the Rambam is putting it, that in fact the minor also has to bring a carbon. So the Magid Mishnah says that yes, it's true the Gemara says that they are compared, but they're compared only in one direction, meaning to say it's always dependent on the way she is. If she is going to be liable, then the man or the boy will also be liable. If she is not liable, then the man is also exempt. And therefore, in our case, since it's all dependent on her, therefore, even though it's a minor, he will also be chayiv. But the Rebbe asks, at the end of the day, how could we say that a little child should be chayiv in anything? The Rebbe looks at the Lechem Mishnah. The Lechem Mishnah explains that the source of the Rambam is actually in a Toiras Koyanim, who has a limud from a pasuk, in this pasuk where it says V'ish, where we learn out that even a 9-year-old boy would be chayiv in this particular case. And therefore, the Rambam has a source for what he's saying. But the Rebbe is asking, seemingly, why should there be a difference? In the case of a Shivcha Charufa, where we're placing this punishment or this carbon on the minor, on the skaton, different to all other dinim, where we don't find such a thing that a child should be chayiv in a carbon, and we don't find anywhere that we should say that it's a gzeiras hakosov, that it's just this is the way the Torah says it here and that's it. In order to understand this, the Rebbe first has a look at other places where we also see that the Rambam seems to be saying that there's a certain obligation on a katan, on a minor. So first of all, in regards to Karban Pesach, the Rambam writes that a child that grew up, that became bar mitzvah between Pesach Rishon and Pesach Sheni, needs to make a Pesach Sheni. He didn't make the Pesach Rishon and needs to make the Pesach Sheni. On the other hand, if he was included in the Pesach Rishon, they shechted for him the Pesach Rishon as well, then he will be exempt. The Kesef Mishnah asks, seemingly this minor wasn't chayav in the Pesach Rishon, so how does it help that they shechted for him the Pesach Rishon if, according to the Torah, he wasn't even chayav? How's that going to help him for Pesach Sheni? So the Kesef Mishnah brings in the name of Mahari Kurkus, that we have a limud in the Torah. The Torah actually includes that we do shecht, or we can count in a minor even for the Karban Pesach. So although, again, of course, he's not obligated, but you could count him in, and there might be an obligation on the father to count him in, and as a result of that, he is going to be exempt by the Pesach Sheni. But the question again becomes, we're speaking about a minor that was not chayiv in Pesach Rishon, so how does it help that the father was obligated to bring for him the Pesach Rishon? How does that help him now in his own obligation of bringing up a Karban Pesach? He should be obligated in the Pesach Sheni. Another example, in Hilchas Talmud Torah. So the Rambam paskins, now the Rebbe brings us someone that his father didn't teach him Torah, he needs to go ahead and teach himself Torah. The Rambam uses the expression mishkishe yakir, when he comes to the recognition, to understanding and recognition. Now interesting, the Rambam doesn't say when he grows up, when he becomes bar mitzvah. The Tzemach Tzedek learns that perhaps over here there's actually an obligation even on the minor. Once he comes to the recognition of his father didn't teach him, that he is chayiv midoiraisa in learning Torah. And again the question becomes, how could there be a chiyuv, an obligation on a katan? In order to understand this, we're going to have a look at something even more perplexing in regards to the chiyuv of the mitzvahs of a child. So the Rebbe brings, generally we have a machloikas when we say that there's midrabanan, there's a mitzvah of educating our children with mitzvahs. Rashi and the Ramban are of the opinion that it's purely a chiyuv, an obligation just on the father. It's nothing to do with the son himself. The child doesn't have any obligation. On the other hand, Tosfos and the Ran learn that the child himself is obligated in those mitzvahs, midirabanan, and the same thing seems to be true that the Rambam also holds this. We find in Hilchas Tzitzis where the Rambam says that a child that knows how to wrap himself in a talis is obligated in Tzitzis because of chinuch. So too he says similar things in regards to Birchas Hamazon, to Sukkah, in Sukkah and Lulav. And here again the question becomes, how can we say there's an obligation for the child to do a mitzvah? To understand this, says the Rebbe, we find in a number of places, in Rambam and so on, and other places, we find that when you're doing something that's an introduction, a necessary introduction, one of the preliminary things that you need to do for a mitzvah, even though it's not part of the mitzvah, it somewhat gets also part of the geder, of the qualities of the mitzvah itself. To the extent, according to the Yerushalmi, when you build a sukkah, not sitting in the sukkah, when you build a sukkah, you have to make a bracha lasais sukkah, and so too when you're putting together the lulav. Furthermore, we see this also in regards to people that might have a participation in the mitzvah or help along in the mitzvah, where once again we say the same idea that because they helped along or made this mitzvah available, so now they also have part in that mitzvah. We find this in regards to marriage. The Ran says that the mitzvah is on the man, not on the woman. But nevertheless, because the only way the man can fulfill the mitzvah is through the woman, so she also has part of the mitzvah. Says the Rebbe, we have in our case, in the idea of being machanech a child to mitzvahs, it's even more than that. Because what's happening over here, it's not only that these children are just needed in order to be able to perform the mitzvah, as some of the cases when you're preparing to do a mitzvah. Rather, over here we're saying that without the child, it's not only the child, the father can't do the mitzvah without the child. It's much more than that. What is the mitzvah? The mitzvah is that the father should educate the child that he should do the mitzvah. According to this, says the Rebbe, according to the Tosfos and the Rambam, it's not only that. In other words, when we speak about the obligation, what we mean over here is, yes, on the one hand, there's the obligation of the father, of course, has the obligation to educate his child. But as a result of this, because the child is the one that's doing the mitzvah, and the whole point is about the child doing the mitzvah, so the Chachamim now place a certain hischayvus, a certain obligation on the child himself as well for this mitzvah, because it's really all about the child doing the mitzvah. That's what the obligation on the father is also. The Rebbe gives an example for this idea. The Rebbe says we find in regards to Simchas Yom Tov, so the Gemara discusses and says that the woman is also obligated in Simcha. So what does it mean, obligated in Simcha? So the Gemara is speaking over there in the context of Aliyah L'Regel. The Gemara mentions that the woman was chayiv to come up to Yerushalayim because of Simchas Yom Tov, in other words, to have part of the karbonis that were brought of Simchas Yom Tov. And Tosfos explains that really it's not her obligation. The obligation is actually on the husband. The husband has to bring her Simcha and have her participate in this carbon. But what do we see from here? That as a result of that, even though it's the husband's obligation, she becomes called chayeves. She was obligated in Simcha. The Rebbe says in a similar way, we could also say in regards to the chiyuv of Talmud Torah regarding the child. And in this case, it's midiraisa, not only midirabanan. Other mitzvahs we say is midirabanan, but educating a child with Torah is midiraisa. Says the Rebbe, so now we could say that because there's a chiyuv midiraisa on this act of teaching the child Torah, the father has to teach him, but as a result of this, now the child gets somewhat of that obligation chiyuv as well. The same thing, says the Rebbe, we can now apply regarding the Pesach Rishon and the Pesach Sheni. Since we say that the Torah said that he could become part of the Pesach Rishon, he could be a member, he could be appointed as one of the members of the Pesach Rishon, that means the Torah itself, as a result of the Torah's mitzvah, so now that this child is becoming in the geder, within the characteristics of the mitzvah, and therefore, yes, if you did shecht for him, so now he's going to be potter, he's going to be exempt from Pesach Sheni. So now the Rebbe gets back to the idea of the Shifcha Charufa. The Gemara says that if the woman gets malchus, he brings a korban. If the woman doesn't get malchus, the man doesn't bring a korban, as mentioned before. Rava in the Gemara explains the reason for this is, because we have, the pasuk starts off as follows. Ish ki ishka vis isha, for man has the relations with the woman, the shifcha charufa, etc., etc. So it was all speaking about what the man does. Then the pasuk says, bikoiris tiyeh, which the Gemara understands, meaning that she's going to get lashes. Then it says, v'hevi es hashamoy, that the man will bring us carbon osham. And so the Gemara says, that's what we say, that the man is dependent on the woman, because why did we interrupt suddenly speaking about the malchus for the woman? So we say when she gets malchus, that's when he gets a carbon. Says the Rebbe, the Rambam is learning that the pasuk is not just telling us the fact the way it is, the halacha, but rather it's explaining to us what's going on over here. Why does he bring a carbon? The reason he's bringing a carbon is because he had brought her to get malchus. In other words, that the obligation or the liability of the man over here is not a chiyuv per se for itself as in other isurim or other arayos, where we say, yes, there's an isur on the man, an isur on the woman, and they're not really dependent on each other. If one is going to be chayiv, the other one, regardless, each one is going to be judged separately. But in our case, we're saying, as a result of the pasuk, what we're learning is, the pasuk is explaining us that the reason he brings an asham is only because he brought her to get malchus. If that's the case, we can apply the same thing now with a little child, or with a 9-year-old at least. In other words, if Torah is saying that his action is the one that's going to cause her to get malchus, that means that gave it that chashivas, that importance, and therefore he's now sort of got somewhat of that chiyuv as well, and that's why he needs to bring a carbon. From this, the Rebbe concludes with a hayrah in the great union of chinuch, especially education for learning Torah. The Rebbe says, especially we're holding out the time between Pesach and Shavuos, which are all very much connected to chinuch. First of all, regarding Pesach, we just spoke about the carbon Pesach that a child is shaykh to. We know V'higadah Levincha, the whole idea of Pesach is teaching our children, answering our children. Pesach is also the time of birth of Am Yisrael. At birth, that's when education starts. Shavuos, this is when our Father in heaven started teaching his children Torah. It's also the time when the Yidden said, our children are our guarantors. So the Rebbe says, the lesson is that dafka when we, as a result of educating our children with mitzvahs, that's what gives that child to become now that independent mitzias, that independent entity that has his own personal connection with the mitzvah itself. Not only his father's connection, but he becomes connected to the mitzvah. And even more than this, says the Rebbe, is true with Talmud Torah, that when we teach a child Torah, we are creating him like a new child. From all of this, says the Rebbe, we understand the importance, how much effort we need to put in to educating our children. The Rebbe says, especially we're coming close to the summer months vacation, to ensure that every child gets a proper full education throughout the summer.